Well, thank you for having me again. It's always a pleasure to talk about insects, but today I will actually focus a bit more on ants in particular, which is a topic of my research for, that's right, now 17 years. Time flies. But what I'm going to talk about today is really the journey, my personal journey. Like, why did I actually came to study ants? Why not birds? Why not elephants? Why not beetles? So I'm just going to try to give you a bit of a sense of where I come from. So I know that many of you probably at this point on have a question that you all want to ask me, and that's how tall I am. So I'm going to clear that one out. I am 2 meters and 3 centimeters, or 6'8". And so this way we can move on. You can look at me. Wow, it's very big. And that's right. I'm actually very tall, and I study small organisms. And actually being very tall is a huge advantage for that, because I can look at them from the trees to deep in the ground. Okay? So as long as my back allows me to do so. So let me tell you where I come from. So I come from France, which is a country of Western Europe. And I actually come from this part here, Brittany, which is a very beautiful place. If you've never been to France, you should go. But if you have been to France and didn't go to Brittany, you should go back to France and visit that region. It's very beautiful because we have some beautiful coasts with some pink granite, and it's really pink. We have beautiful castles like that just by the ocean, so it's actually quite amazing to see those. We have great cities that are also by the ocean, that are like pretty old ones, and we have great food, okay? Crepe and cider. When we talk about France, of course, we always talk about food, so it's a very good region to actually go and visit. But when I started my studies, I actually went to that other town here called Angers on the Loire Valley, close to the Loire River. It's very nice, has very good wine, if you like wine, and also has beautiful castles. I mean, anywhere you go in France, you always have beautiful castles. But this is actually a very nice one. So that's where I started, and I grew up, I will say. But the reason why I became a biologist is because of this man right here and right here. And this man is my father. And my father is actually, so I'm telling him thank you for that, is actually a phytopathologist. Okay, so what is that complicated name? Well, a phytopathologist is a doctor for plants. Okay, so when you're sick, you're going to see a doctor. Well, when plants are sick, my father goes to see the plant. Okay, so that's actually his job. And of course, he does not just go in any forest and actually heal trees. No, he works mainly in agriculture. And now he has been retired for 10 years as his main job, but he's using all his knowledge to actually help people all over the world to have sustainable agriculture. So this way, it's better for the environment, and it's also better for the people here in Madagascar, where he has been working now for over 8 years, where he has programmed and helping communities to develop actually sustainable agriculture, both in terms of economy and as well for the environment. So it's always a source of inspiration for myself, and I hope for others as well. And this is me. Yes, that was the 80s, okay? So we all know this kind of haircut. And that's about the time where I started getting interested in insects, okay? Because my father loves plants. And so he was also growing plants at home. He had a small garden, and he was always taking care of it. He had all kinds of beautiful flowers. And I think he was trying to get me involved and interested. And in a way, he kind of failed. And I'm very sorry for him, because instead of being attracted by the plants he was growing, I was attracted by all little creatures that were actually running all over the plants. And those were the insects. And that's where I started getting interested in insects. That's thanks to him. That's the kind of creatures that you could find in my bedroom when I was a kid or a teenager. Okay, so I had actually several hundreds, maybe even thousands of those, which is the giant hissing cockroach from Madagascar, I had other species, Blaeberris fusca, which has wings. And here you can see a juvenile, so a young one that has no wings at this point. And I really, really had a lot of them. It was a lot of fun. My cat also had a lot of fun looking at them and being afraid of them sometimes. Sometimes putting some terrarium on the ground, and then I had to pick them up one by one after they escaped. But I also had, oh yeah, and those are great pets, okay? So I see there's some parents in the room here. Let your kids actually have those if they want to have them. Yeah, no, I promise, it's actually completely harmless, and if they're taken good care of, they don't smell. People think, but it's smelly and everything. No, it's not. Less than a cat, less than a dog. And they are great. They are great for observation. You can manipulate them. Again, it can be fun. I also have a lot of stick insects. I think at some point I had more than 10 different species that I was keeping. So in Hong Kong, we are lucky because there's several species you can find. Where I was living in France, actually, there was not many species. And then I live in Montreal. I will tell you that later. I had even more species there. I had some crickets and grasshopper, everything I could catch in the grassland, basically, I was bringing back home. And of course, I had some ants. But I have to be honest with you, at that time, ants were not a big success. Like, I was not able to maintain colonies for a very long time. Hopefully, it changed a few years later. And a lot of other things that I kept, pretty much everything I could maintain in my bedroom, I was trying to keep them. So, as I said, I stayed here in Angers as a student, and I'm going to give you a confidence. I was not a good student. Actually, I was a pretty bad student back then. So I went to college for 3 years in France. I think I did not even finish the third year. I was really that bad because I was not really motivated. But I knew that what I wanted to study was biology because I love creatures. I wanted to protect the environment. I wanted to do things that were useful. So my father encouraged me, say, okay, maybe you don't like the educational system in France. Maybe you should try somewhere else. And then I decided to actually fly to Montreal in Canada. So I was 21 years old. I was not that old. But I decided to just leave my hometown and go live in Canada. And there, I actually loved studying. So I switched from not a very good student to, let's say it, a very good student. So at least I really wanted to learn as much as I could. And so I spent 4 years in Montreal, and I'm going to tell you what I did. But the first thing is, it's at that time of my life, so when I was about 21 years old, that I started studying and learning about ants. And that was just like falling in love. And that love never disappeared. Actually, it's kept growing and growing. So just to give you a bit of a timeline, I was in France, as in 2002 I left, and I had a chance to work on a project in the biodome of Montreal. So probably you don't know the biodome, but imagine something quite similar to the Hong Kong Wetland Park, where you can actually go and visit different kind of ecosystems that are being reproduced. And so here, this is a view from the top. So because it's Montreal, it's quite cold during the winter time. So of course, you need to put it within an entire building. And this is a zoological garden. And so you can just walk through different ecosystems. So people walk in the bottom here and over there. And they can actually see a lot of animals and plants. And they can just look at that. And one of the parts that they have is actually a reproduction of a primary forest from Costa Rica, so from Central America, so very hot climate. So inside, the temperature is always above 30 degrees. And when I started walking there, it was actually January in Montreal. So outside, it was minus 30 degrees, and then I was going inside, and it was plus 30 degrees. So my body every day was experiencing a 60-degree difference like that in just a few minutes. I had my nose bleeding like almost every day. That was really crazy. But I loved it because there was that ant here. And that ant was one of the species that was actually introduced with all the plants. So people who actually developed this ecosystem here, they bought some plants that they had coming from different parts of the world, and in particular from Central America. And unfortunately, when they bought the plants, they also bought the ants. They didn't pay for it. They didn't want them, probably. But the ants came anyway. And so those ants start reproducing. They were very good there, and they kept growing, until they really start making some problems. And that was one of my friends over there. So this is a Goldie Marmoset. And those little ants that you can see here, they are not big. They are just about 1.5 millimeter long. They actually sting the animals. Okay? So the animals were being stung by the ants. So of course it's a problem when you try to protect and keep them within some enclosure because they cannot escape. And those ants are all over infesting the things. And so those little ants, so you can see the scale here. This is a 0.2 millimeter scale bar. So you can see that ant is really not that big. They are actually very good at stinging people and animals. And it was to the point that the zookeeper, so the people working in a zoo, they actually threatened to go on strike because they said, we cannot keep working in those conditions. We are being stung like every day, and it's really, really painful. Actually, that ant is known as the electric little ant because when it stings you, it feels like somebody is buzzing you, okay, with an electric charge. So it's really not a pleasant feeling. And I was just an undergrad back then, and my first work was actually to make an inventory of the ant species that were present and study the interaction between the ant species that were found. So again, there was a completely artificial ecosystem, and yet they had 8 different species of ants that I was able to find there, and it was not a very big area. So all those ants actually had been introduced through the people bringing plants and other goods into this habitat. So that was my first experience of ants, but I completely loved it. I was completely seduced by ants and the work with them. So what I decided to do, or what I was offered to do actually, was to do an MPhil, a master degree. And at that point, I actually said, okay, but I want to keep ants again in a system. And that's what I did. And I studied ant aphid mutualism and the relationship with the predators. Okay? So ants are great because they have all kinds of domesticated animals, other animals that are actually keeping with them, and some of them are aphids. And here you can see you have aphid colonies, so those are actually on plants, and they are getting the sap from the plant. Okay? So they are extracting the sap from the plant, that's how they feed themselves. But because they actually ingest a lot of it, they have to excrete some of it. And this is the droplet you can actually see here. This is basically the aphid poo, if you prefer. Okay? But it's very sweet, and ants love it. So the ants will always be trying to get that honeydew, which is the name of that very sweet liquid. And in exchange, the ants will protect the aphids against their predators. Okay? So here's a lady beetle. And the lady beetle actually will be feeding on the aphids. They are very voracious, actually, they eat a lot of them. But the ants will come and, like a bodyguard, they will come and actually kick the lady beetle away. So the aphids, this way, stay protected. Just the same way that humans will be protecting the herd of sheep or cows, ants will be doing the same with their aphids, or here in Hong Kong with the scale insects. But what I was interested in was actually this little thing right here. Okay? So this is the larvae of a very, very small fly. Okay? Actually, the scientific name is Aphidoletes aphidimisa. This is a Cystidomyidae, if there's any entomologist in the room. And that little larvae has a very strange or very interesting strategy to actually eat the aphids. It is called a furtive predator. And let me explain why is it called a furtive predator. So that larvae moves very slowly. It's barely discernible with a naked eye. It just crawls very slowly until it gets to touch the aphid. Once it gets in contact with the aphid, it's biting it, and the first thing it's going to do is to inject a toxin that will freeze the aphid. The aphid cannot move anymore. So because of that, the aphid cannot warn the other aphids and the ants potentially around that it's being attacked by a predator, which is what the aphids will be doing by releasing some pheromones, which are molecules of alarm pheromones, which alarm the other aphids around. Oops, I went too quick. And so the advantage here for this larvae is that because it's not being detected by the ants or by the other aphid, they are actually able to survive within the aphid colonies that are tended by ants. Now, the other piece of the story is that those larvae here are also being eaten by the lady beetles or other predators. So, in fact, the ants are protecting the aphids, or at least I think they do, but they're also protecting the predators. So it's a very interesting system where the predators escape their own predation thanks to the ants, which do it despite their own will. So this is what I did for a couple of years while I was in Montreal. And I think about 3 months before I left Montreal, somebody, a biologist, Ed Wilson, came to Montreal. I don't know if any of you have heard about Ed Wilson, but he's probably one of the most, if not the most famous ecologist, living ecologist at the time. Okay, he has been a famous ecologist, but also for conservation, and is one of the most respected myrmecologists, somebody who actually study ants. And he has wrote books like that with his colleague Bert Oldobler, which won the Pulitzer Prize. There was some videos that were made where he's called the Lord of the Ants. As to tell you, he's a Lord of the Ants, so it's very important. And if you're a biologist, he's also one of the father of Island Biography, of sociobiology, etc. So he's a very, very important man in biology. For me, if I was playing in a rock band, it would be like meeting Mick Jagger. Okay, or your favorite pop star, or whoever. That was really like somebody very important. And then, at that time, that night, I went to talk with him, or at least I tried to, because living in Montreal has something similar with France, that they speak French, and me back then, I was not speaking very good French, or very good English, well, maybe not very good French either, but English, definitely not so well. And so he came, and he was asking me questions, and I was like, I could not respond it. Well, I read many of his work, I could read English, but I could not speak it. And I was so frustrated that night that I actually decided I'm going to continue my studies, but this time it will be in English. So I will never experience that ever again. So that's what pushed me to actually do another journey. And this time, I moved south. Okay, I went to the US directly, and I went to North Carolina at NC State, North Carolina State University. And I was very lucky because there was a very young professor back then. I was his first student, Dr. Rob Dunn, who agreed to take me in his lab. And actually, I didn't know Rob. Rob didn't know me. But it turned out Rob is a fantastic advisor, so I was really lucky. And he's also a great writer, so if you're looking for some book to read in English, I don't know if they have been translated, I'm sorry, but he has some very interesting books that are very accessible for people as well to read, so you can have a look at those. So with Rob, I actually started working also on ants. I'm sure you understood that. And he told me, well, Benoit, I would like you to go to Australia and look at myrmecochory of ants. So what is that funny word, myrmecochory? So actually, many ant species around the world are eating seeds. This is a seed right here. Okay, it's from an acacia tree. But some ants are actually not just eating seed. They will only eat a part of the seed, which is this part right here. Okay, the kind of yellow part. And this part is called an eleosome. This is a part that the plant will produce only to attract the ants. And the ants will actually take the seed, disperse it away. So there is a first benefit for the plant here, because the seed is going further from the parent plant, and that means it will reduce competition with the potential parents or other seeds. But what the ants will also do is that they will bring the seeds underground. And by being underground, the seeds will become protected. Actually, it gets protected from a few things. The first one is desiccation. You can see the background here. So this is in Australia. This is in a desert north of Perth, so on the western coast of Australia. And it can get very, very hot. Okay? And if you leave the seed on the ground, they will get desiccated, and at some point they will die. So they will not be viable anymore for germination. You also have all kinds of animals that are eating the seeds, but those are really eating them completely, so the seeds are not viable anymore. So by being within the nest of the ants, the seed is being protected. And then there's one more thing that is very important, is that this entire ecosystem, they are actually under the regime of fire. So you have frequent fire. And if the seeds, again, are on the ground like that, and you have a fire coming, of course the seeds will burn and they will not be able to produce a plant later on. So by being just a few centimeters underground thanks to the ants, the seeds will actually see their germination rate increase a lot. So that's what I studied. And to give you a full story here, we are looking at seeds that were found in emu poo. So you know emu are those big birds. They are basically like the ostrich of Australia. And they eat a lot of seeds. That's their main food source. And then they will poo, and it's full of seeds. And sometimes the ants come and actually will also disperse us. So we are looking at those. And it's funny how the shape that emu poo can have. I mean, I've studied that for quite a few weeks. That was quite interesting. So this is, again, the main protection from fire that those seeds are having. But then when I arrived in North Carolina, I think it took me about a couple of weeks. Of course, I went in the forest and I was looking for ants. And I discovered something that was very unusual. There was that ant here, which is called Brachioponera Kinensis, or the Asian needle ant. And actually, what I figured during my PhD is that that ant was a new invasive ant in North America. And so that's the part of the story I'm going to tell you now. So this is the name of this ant. It's also called as Asian needle ant. And needle ant because he has a stinger. We don't see it very well on that picture, but there's a stinger. And when he stings, he hurts quite a bit. Actually, I'm going to talk more about that later, so I'm not going to tell you too much. And this is the potential distribution of that species. So you see I have two colors here. There's a yellow one, and there's an orange one. The orange one are the one where we know it is actually that species. The yellow one, well, we're not quite sure. And I will explain why we're not quite sure in a few more slides. But just to give you an idea, this is native from Eastern Asia. How far does it go? This is still a little bit uncertain, but at least from Japan, it's native, Taiwan. They are in Hong Kong. They are very rare, but they are found in Hong Kong and also in other parts of China. Okay? So my first kind of work here was to know, okay, when that species was introduced and how extended is it in the US. And actually the first colonies that were introduced were right here, those 3 ponds along the coast of North Carolina and northern and southern Virginia. And you see that from the 1932 to 1950, I was able to find that most of the ponds were along the coast. And then we had in the late 40s a couple of ponds that were more inland. And so I actually look at the distribution of that species over time. And if we switch to 1951 to 1970, we have a few more ponds. So clearly that species is not super common. Maybe nobody was looking at it, but actually I have reason to believe that it was not so common back then. And then if I had another 20 years, so up to 1990s, it starts going a bit more inland. It goes a bit further north as well. And then comes the 1991 to 2010 period. And you can see that we actually start finding it in many more regions. It's becoming a bit more abundant. And then this is the situation as we know it out of 2017. And you can see that species is clearly spreading. And so now we have records further north, in particular here, this one in Wisconsin, and also further west and further south. Okay, so clearly we have a pattern here where we have a species that was introduced from Asia into North America and was first established along the coastline and maybe some germ dispersal. And then further and further, it becomes more and more abundant, and also it expands its range. So this is something that is a bit worrisome because this is not a good species to have. And we try to predict where that species could actually invade. So this is, again, the native range where that species is coming from. And potentially in China, it could be the range could be much further based on the climate. Okay, so we try to put that based on the climate of the species. And this is what we know as a potential distribution in the southeast United States. So you see there is still some margin for extension, nearly in Texas as well. And then we also found some points for which we didn't know if that ant was present, but potentially the climate was sustainable for those species to actually get established there. And actually we published this paper in 2013, and 3 years or 4 years later, there was some records that actually were coming from Georgia and southern Russia. Okay, so that ant had been introduced also in this part of the world, and this is good because that showed that our model actually was validated. In a part of the world for which we have no information, it could be there, and say, okay, well, it looks like it could be there. Well, actually, it was found just a few years after. Okay? So it's working, and unfortunately, you can see that that species still has quite some range for expansion. Now, why are we worried about that species? It's because this species is actually very aggressive against other insects. So here you can see, for example, this species eating termites. And in Japan, it was known as being a termite specialist, so eating a lot of termites and being very good at it. So you might think, oh, that's fantastic, an ant that killed the termites, great. I hate termites, they're hitting my house or they're hitting other things. No, actually termites are very important in ecosystem. We need termites because those are the ones that are breaking down the dead trees, the dead wood, and recycling the nutrients to make them accessible for other plant species or other organisms to also nest in the soil. So we need termites, and having that ant eating termites is not a good thing. They're also eating prey that are much larger than them. So here there was a yellow jacket, or a wasp if you prefer. And part of my work was actually to look what was the impact of that species on ant communities. So here, I'm not going to go much into the detail, but what I want you to pay attention are the trends. And very simply here, we have different groups of ants, so 4 of them. And the higher it goes on the y-axis, so this axis here, the more species you have. And of course, as it goes down, you have less species. And this axis here is the same for the 4 figure. This is the number of Asian needle ant that you will find. Okay? So for the first 2 points, you have none of them being found. Oops, sorry. For the first 2 points, you have none of them being found. And here you have 1 to 5, up to 50 to 500 individuals being found. And you see that as you increase the density of the Asian needle ant, the other species, they disappear. Okay? So we have a lot of extinction that you can see here. And this is a problem because this group of species here, Aphid, this is a genus of ant, is very important. It's important because this is an ant that actually will disperse a lot of seeds of small plants in the forest of eastern North America. Okay? And what happens when you have the Asian needle ant invading them is that they will actually remove all those species here. So they will become extinct. And this ant, the Asian needle ant, is not very good at actually dispersing the seeds. In fact, the rate of seed dispersal decreased by 70%. So that means that the seeds that receive a benefit from the ants by being dispersed, this benefit is reduced by 70%. So that's actually a big change in the ecosystem over there. And you can see here we have a graph where we have invaded plots, so those are the white one, and those where they are intact, so no Asian needle ant. And what you can see is that this group of ants species, so the Aphid, they are completely gone. Okay, they do not survive in presence of the Asian needle ant. Now, while I was actually working on my PhD, I published some of the first paper, and I had a website where I was explaining why that ant could be a problem. And one day, this man here, Bob Went, he was 63 years old at the time, and he was somebody living in South Carolina, and he told me that actually he was stung by an ant. And after that, he experienced an anaphylactic shock. So basically, he could not breathe anymore. And he had to be hospitalized in an emergency, and fortunately for him, he was safe, but his life was seriously threatened. And since he explained to me that actually he had a garden but he didn't want to go in his garden anymore because he was too scared for that to happen to him again. And at first I felt very sorry for him, of course, but I'm not a medical doctor, so I didn't have a solution. But then as the year passed, I received more and more emails like those of Bob Wen. And actually in 6 years, I had 21 persons who contacted me, with 12 of them having experienced severe allergic reaction, such as anaphylactic shock, so that way people cannot breathe again. I never advertised for people to contact me. Okay? So just people were so worried about their situation that they found me and they contacted me. So if I had 21 people contacting me, that means that potentially this kind of situation is happening to hundreds of thousands of people. Okay? So you can see that how having a new ant species introduced somewhere can really change the life of people. And here, just so you know, I'm going to show you 2 extracts of email that I received, and I'm going to read them. So the first one, the person was saying, it was an awful bite. I would rather suffer through a fire ant bite than this. Because the fire ants, they also occur in this part of the world. So people did not care because they thought, oh, I'm being bitten by an ant. It might be a fire ant. And then a few people were like, no, it doesn't look like fire ant. It's something else. And then they contact me to actually have confirmation. Sometimes a good thing. Then the person continued, said, it initially hurts, then it helps for a day or two, just out of the blue. Awful. In fact, I am dealing with a bite from one right now I received this morning. So this is something that is very special. I've been stung by a lot of insects, I have to tell you. And the Asian needle ant has one of the most curious stinger. When it stings you, the pain is very sharp at first, and then it lasts for maybe half a minute to a minute, the pain, and then it disappears. And then suddenly, between 10 to 20 minutes later, you feel like, oh, I've been stung again. And then you look, there's nothing. And actually, this is the previous pain you received, the previous stinger. So the pain just comes back. And then it goes, for some people, it can do that up to a period of 2 days. Okay? So imagine you have the pain coming back, disappearing, coming back, disappearing, coming back, etc., for a couple of days. So it's a very kind of annoying type of pain. Here's a second person that says, I have a pretty intense reaction to the sting, severe swelling, pain, itching, bruising, cramps, tight abdominal muscle, and nausea that lasts for about a week. Okay? Actually, one of the papers I presented earlier, I published it with one of my colleagues who is from Mississippi, and he told me he has been stung as well, and he experienced this kind of symptom himself. This is not him telling me that, but he had nausea, which I didn't know. I never had that. I've been stung by that hundreds of times, even on the lips and things like that. But for some people, it's a very, very strong reaction. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that everything is bad about ants, and even for that species which is invasive. Of course, it would be better if that species was not invasive in the US or in other parts of the world. But there was also some cool stuff that while I was studying them, I was lucky enough to discover. One was a new foraging behavior. So let me explain what I mean by that. So for ants, you might know that ants use recruitment when they find food to attract other nestmates to come and collect the food with them. And some that are well known are the use of Furman Trails, or another one which is tandem running. So let me show you what it is. So maybe you see some ants doing this kind of pattern. So one ant, or all of them actually, will lay some pheromones, and it's making a chemical road, and where all the ants will be following that trail. Okay, so they will basically going from the nest to the food using that chemical trail. Some other ants, they will actually do what we call tandem running, where they will keep contact with the ant that is above them, and so they keep antenating, so they use the antennae to actually keep contact with the one above them, and they will just walk like that in a very tight group. Sometimes it can only be 2. Sometimes you can have groups up to a few hundreds. It depends on the species. They have different strategy for that. But while I was studying the Asian needle ant, I observed something different. And so let's imagine that we have our ant nest here, ant nest of the Asian needle ant, and then there is some food. Okay, it's bad food, but it doesn't matter. These ants, they just take anything that you give them. So we have a scout, which is a worker which mission is actually to find food. Okay, so it just go around the environment until he can find food. So let's have that ants exploring. Oh, find food. Fantastic. Eureka. I found something great for the colony. So what that ant's going to do is actually is going to hit a little bit and go back to the nest. And in a pretty much in a straight line. We're not quite sure how the ants do that, but they are able to orientate themselves, and they can go back pretty much this way, even if before they have been in all kinds of direction. And then in the nest, that scout here will do something very interesting. It will actually stimulate another worker to take this kind of very strange position. We call it a nymphal position. That's the position of the ants when they are about to change into an adult. Okay, so they transition from a larvae to an adult, and so they have the nymphal stage. And so the ants will take that position. So the scout is right here, and this is a new ant, okay, that is being recruited. And what this ant will do, they will be carrying each other. Oh, sorry, one is carrying the other one, and we'll bring it back again to the food. And after that, what the second ant that was carried was done. Of course, he was going to be released. He's going to take some food, and then going back straight to the nest with the food. And then he will amplify. So the one that was carried will start doing it and bring some more, and he will keep doing that and doing that. And so I've done some experiments to actually see that there is no pheromones being involved, and there is no pheromones being involved. So what I think so far is that these ants are able to visualize their environment and to memorize their environment so they can go directly to the food source. During my time studying the Asian needle ant, I had the chance to go for the first time in Japan. And so I went to the city or prefecture called Okayama, and I wanted to study the Asian needle ant in its native range, which is what I've done. But what I talk about now is how I found my first new species for science. Okay? I found a new ant species. And that new species, I was actually digging up some piece of wood. This is where you will find nest of Brachioponera Kinensis, the Asian needle ant, and I was opening them up. And there's one thing I love with that species, is that you can collect a lot of them and put them in a valve, like say a plastic container, for example. And these ants, contrary to many other species, they cannot climb. Okay, so you can have even hundreds of thousands all together. They cannot climb the container. So it's great. And so I was doing that in Japan, and I realized that one of my containers that was open, the ants could climb halfway. I was like, whoa, what's going on here? Why my ants are able to climb halfway? So I thought maybe my container is dirty. So by being dirty, there is more rugosity, and so the ants can climb. So I cleaned it up with my finger, thought that would be enough, but they could still climb. Okay? So then I thought, okay, I'm going to clean it better. So I took a piece of tissue and I really cleaned it well and make sure everything was fine. And still, they could climb. So I started looking at them a bit more carefully. And when I did that, I realized that that ant looked exactly the same, except that it was smaller. Okay, so you can see this one is big, this one is small. It's obvious, right? You can say, no, it's not supposed to be. But that's how I was able to first in the field see them. So I went back to the lab of my colleague, Dr. Kenji Matsuura, and I started measuring them. And then I realized that actually we had some nests where the ants were clearly much larger, and in other nests, they were much smaller. And one thing also in the field that surprised me is that when I open the wood, based on my experience in North America, the place where you will always find the Asian needle ant, Brachioponera Kinensis, are in pieces of logs or dead wood like that, which are full of water. When you take into your finger and you squeeze them, there is the water dripping. It's almost like sponge. They love this kind of habitat. I was never find them in piece of wood that were dry, okay, dry wood. While the smaller ants here was actually inhabiting piece of wood that were completely dry. So at first I was very surprised, and then I realized it's because that was a different species. So we described that species using molecular work, morphological characters, as well as ecological evidence. But here we had two species, those actually called cryptic species. They look very similar to one another, but they're actually two different species. So that was my first discovery of a new species in Japan. That was quite good. So this one is just a bit smaller. Okay, now it's also during my PhD that I start being interested by the distribution of ants globally. And sometimes I wish I could say, yeah, I had this idea, I was really thinking very deep, and I got this idea of looking at distribution of ants. No, it came from a very random discussion. So I went on a field trip with my PhD advisor, Rob Dunn, and another colleague, and I was driving. So because I was the driver, I had to be focused on the road, and I could not follow the discussion very well. But then at some point, they were talking about that ant species that one of them found in Madagascar. And I kind of scratched the back of my head thinking like, wait, that doesn't make sense. That species does not occur in Madagascar. This is off the coast of Africa. It's way too far. This species occurs in North America, in France, in Japan, but not in Madagascar. And then I tried to find for information about where the species actually occur. And I could not find that information. And I realized that actually for most species or most genera of ants, this was not available. So I thought I would create that tool. If it does not exist, probably I'm not the only person, at least not the only ant biologist, that wonder where we can find species all around the world. So this is what we have here, the ants actually all around the world. And so it took me about 3 years, but I created the first global database about ant distribution. But at that time, I did it at something that is a genus level. I will explain that just in a minute, not at the species level. And we are able to understand for the first time question how are ants distributed globally. So you can see all the different genera. So there's 334 genera known currently. And one thing I realized is that the most diverse part of the world was actually here in Asia. So that also influenced my choice later on to come to work in Asia, and in particular in tropical Asia. But that's where I need to be. If I want to study ants for the rest of my life, that's this part of the world that I need to be. That's where I'm going to get the good stuff. And I also look at something that was, where are the parts of the world that we did not explore? Okay? Where could we find more potential new species? So this is what you can see, and I'm not going to show you the detail about the different colors, but pretty much most of the regions that are colored, except a few weird exceptions here, this is where we should go to collect new ants. If you want to find a lot of new records, potentially a lot of new species, you can go to Laos or Cambodia. There's not much work being done, at least when I did that work several years ago, it's still true, and you can find a lot of new genera over there. But at that time, I worked at the genus level. I did not do it for the species level. And so that was one of the problems here, and I will explain to you what is the genus versus species. So remember my two species here? This is the Asian needle ant. This is a new species that was described. So Brachioponera Kinensis and Brachioponera nakasuji, okay, which was a new species we described. You can realize that they have the same name here, Brachioponera for both of them. Okay? This is the genus level. Okay? What that means is that these two species, they have a common ancestor, if taxonomy is done properly. Okay? And then the species epithet is actually right here. Okay? So if we do that, if we just look at ants very simply, this is the same genus, but we have different species. Okay? So what I did at first, the ant genera of the world, was just for the genera. And for ants, there's 334 genera. For species, there's over 15,450. So you see, it's not exactly the same amount of work here. But of course, if you only use that level, you're losing a lot of information contained in that level. So the ultimate goal was actually to get the species level, which is what I decided to do. But for that, I had to take another journey, and that's what I did during my postdoc. And this time, I crossed a different ocean, and I went to Okinawa in Japan. Okay, so went back to Japan, and I work at the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology, which is a beautiful place. If you ever go in Okinawa one day, you should actually go and visit. It's very nice. And I work with this gentleman here, Dr. Evan Economo, and we developed what is known as the Global Ant Biodiversity Informatics Project, or GABI. GABI is simpler to remember. And basically, our goal was to have the distribution for all ant species. And as I speak today, we have entered 2.4 million records for ants all over the world. And they have all been entered manually, so I can tell you that's a lot of work. And we also made a website called Antmap, so you can use it, not in that room because I think internet doesn't work so well, but as you go outside, you can just try antmap.org, and you could explore the distribution of every single of the over 15,000 species, all the genera, any taxa that you want. You can also look at the overall diversity for a region, so this is how we know it. Doesn't mean it's exactly how it's supposed to be. And you can compare different regions between each other. Now, one of the things that is crazy, so that website actually just celebrated its 4th anniversary, and we're getting close to get 400,000 users. So it's pretty successful for a website just talking about ants and showing their distribution. So not bad. Now, in 2014, I was fortunate to get a position at the University of Hong Kong, so HKU, and that's where I've been since. And I developed the Insect Biodiversity and Biography Laboratory, where you have 2 members in the room. There's Kin and Abigail here. And of course, I keep working on that because I think all my life now I'm tired to work on that. It's kind of too big of a project to let it drop. And we're also interested in actually not just knowing the distribution of the ants, but how we can use that distribution to infer other things, and in particular, how we can protect ants. And so here, this is an assessment of the ants of Hong Kong that we have been doing. And we are able to say which species are being threatened, okay, which species are not threatened. And here in Hong Kong, you can see that the one in orange, for example, are some of the species that we classified as endangered. So there are species of ants, you might not think about them as such, but actually that are threatened as well. It's not just about elephants and things like that. And what we did is that we look at different models. So this one is based on the threat level. And the Hong Kong park system, is it protecting all the 300 species of ants that are in Hong Kong? Are we species richness? And in average, I doubt this is really going to happen, but if the government one day comes and say which part of Hong Kong should we protect to make sure we can protect ants, we could tell them, well, here are the parts in brown that actually you should probably try to expand, so you will really protect the biodiversity and diversity of ants in Hong Kong. Another thing that what we do is to discover and describe new species. So I told you Brachioponera Kinensis, Brachioponera Kinensis was my first one, since they had quite a few. And here in Hong Kong so far, we discovered 5 new species. So maybe some of you heard it in the media. And the last one is actually, Ponera Tuligong, after one of the gods in Buddhist mythology. And this one was actually published just this week. So that's a new species for Hong Kong that just came out, actually. And what I can tell you is that here in Hong Kong and all over Asia, there's probably thousands of new species to be described for ants, but all kinds of other things. We also just this week described 3 new species of flies from Hong Kong. So we just don't do ants, but other things, but flies. And of course, because of my experience working with Brachioponera Kinensis, the Asian needle ants, I'm very interested by the exotic species and invasive ant species. And this is just a little graph here that shows you the numbers of exotic species that are recorded in Hong Kong over time. And you can see, so this is 2019, and you can see that numbers is literally exploding. I have to say I'm quite responsible for that, because we find things when we start looking for them. If nobody look for them, of course, you're not going to find anything. But because we start, and this is a bit worrisome, because as I mentioned, one of them, you might know, the fire ants, which was actually discovered in the early 2000s. So not by me, but there's also many other species that might impact native species or humans. So we have to be very careful of that and make sure we do the right thing. And Kin, who is in the back, just got a paper published, actually accepted today. So he could tell you about the impact of the fire ants on the farmers of Hong Kong, for example, and some of the repercussions for education and other aspects in terms of economy and health. We also look at the impact of habitat conversion. So when you have a forest and you convert it, for example, to a rubber plantation, what happened to the communities of ants living there? And how can we improve modified habitat to make sure we can still sustain diversity? So how we can make sure that urban ecosystem or even rubber plantation can actually still sustain more species than what they are doing now. So kind of preserving part of biodiversity. And so this is an example here with some of the projects we have been doing in Vietnam, for example. So you can see you have, oops, sorry, I'm just going to go back to that one. So you have beautiful primary forest with large trees, sometimes some very large trees. So I am right here. Okay, so you feel very small when you see trees like that. It's absolutely stunning. But unfortunately, more and more areas in Vietnam, Thailand, and also in Yunnan in China are being turned into this kind of ecosystem, which are rubber plantation. Not diverse in terms of tree diversity, clearly not very old. You can see the trees are very small. And so we are looking what are the impacts for insects as well. But now let me tell you maybe something a bit more fun. How do we sample ants? And so this is work that is funded by National Geographic. So the great thing when we do this kind of field work, we get the chance to experience all kinds of public transportation, including some motorcycle, boat, and even sometimes some tractor, so everything we can to actually move. But most of the time we actually walk, or we try to when we don't have rivers that we need to cross. And so here we can see that this is all our samples that we try to protect. Sometimes you have no other choice than to find the best way to actually cross a river when it's flooded. So it's a bit of an adventure. It's raining a lot, and you're there for the day, so you have no choice that being completely soaked. But always keep a good attitude with a smile and enjoy the day. Now the way we sample, so we focus specifically on the ants that lives in the leaf litter. And so those ants are actually very important to us because we can standardize our sampling efforts. So you can see here we sample 1 meter square. So everywhere we go, we have exactly 1 meter square, so we can replicate and compare. And here we put the leaf litter into a sifter that you can see here. Here we have Rangzi with one of my PhD students sifting the leaf litter. And sometimes you have to be careful, so we wear gloves because you might have some other things in the leaf litter that wants to protect their habitat, and we're fine with that. We just let them go. And then once we have all the leaf litter, we actually hang it for usually 72 hours. So the leaf litter will dry, and by drying, the arthropods will actually fall into cups that we put in the very bottom. And we have ethanol on those cups, and so we can collect a lot of arthropods. So when we do like different field works like that, sometimes we can have 40 or 50 of those bags hanging. So the difficulty for us is to find where to hang them. And then we spend a lot of time in the field to do the first pass of sorting. So this, you can see here, this is what all the arthropods are in the bottom after 24 hours. We actually change them every 24 hours. And then at the end, we do have a lot of equipment to bring back. So it's actually, we need some solid muscles there to make sure we can carry everything. But unfortunately, the more I travel all around the world, what I realize is that this kind of landscape are more and more rare and difficult to find, and are being replaced progressively by this. And this is quite saddening, actually, when you see the world being transformed so quickly, even sometimes in region you just went 2 or 3 years before. And this is just to show you of all the place we're doing fieldwork. So you can see I've been spending a lot of efforts recently in Asia. But sometimes we also have some great opportunities, so such as climbing trees. So here that was in Costa Rica. It was climbing a 35-meter tree. So it doesn't look like that, but I probably have 25 meters of nothing below me. So it's quite a challenge. And then when you reach the top, you're quite happy. It's a bit hot as well. As you can see, there's a lot of effort. I'm not that dirty usually. But then you can collect ants, so on top of 35-meter canopy. This is quite a unique experience to have. And you can take picture. and actually I will show you the results of that picture. This is right here. So I was taking it. So that was a beautiful fly. So you can see some novel new insects that you've never seen, some great ants as well. And then the reason why I climbed was for those ants. They are known as the turtle ant, the genus of ants called Cephalotes. And they have great morphology. I really like their good-looking kind of ants, very fierce, a lot of spines and everything. But don't worry, they are completely harmless because what they eat is pollen, honeydew, and bird poo, okay, most of the time. So even if they wanted to bite you, they can't. Their mandibles cannot open wide enough. They are very harmless. But they have something great that they're actually doing. And this man here, Dr. Steve Janowiak, actually is a person who discovered them. And Steve is a very nice guy, as you can see on the picture. And he's the one who helped me to climb to trees. And I really wanted to see his discovery because that was so exciting to me that I asked him, can we do it together? And I will share it with you. So those ants, actually, they can glide. Okay, so they have no wings. And you will think they probably drop from the trees, but actually, no, they can glide. And that's what I'm going to show you right now, how he discovered that. Whoop. Have it here. All right, so this is a control where Steve just dropped, it's not an ant, just going to play it again so you can see. Whoopla. So he's just going to drop like a little marble. So if you pay attention, you will see where a marble, or me, if I was to fall off the tree, would be falling. Okay, so that's the trajectory, the vertical trajectory. Now, if you want to see if something can fly or glide, you have to have the control and see how that actually deviates from that. Now, pay attention to what's going to happen. So the marble will fall like this. And then he's going to try with ants. And so he put some blue on it so you can see it better. And you see, whoop! So the ant actually, and that's a different one, whoop, he always go back to the tree trunk. So not only it glides, but it's able in just a few meters reposition itself and direct itself so it goes back to the tree trunk. So why ants do that? It's because if you're an arboreal ant and you fall on the ground, you're pretty much certain to be dead within a few minutes after you touch the ground. Okay? This is not the habitat where you'll be doing very well. But if the ants are actually able to go back to the tree trunk, they actually climb back and then cross your legs a few minutes later. This is actually what happened. So when I went with Steve, we did exactly what we did in this experiment. We put some dye into the ants, we dropped them, and we dropped quite a few of them. We are so excited. Oh, that's so cool. And we look at them, and just a few minutes later, you can see the same ants that you had dropped. They're coming back and cross around your legs. So the ants, even if they fall off the trees, they can actually redirect themselves, glide using their body, and then hop, walk back up the trees. That is really cool. And Steve has been dropping all kinds of insects. So he had several years where he was just a maniac dropping everything he could find in the canopy. And actually, you'll be surprised. Even insects that you will never find could glide or fly actually are very good at doing it. So many arboreal insects are able to glide. And not only they can glide, but again, they all can see the tree trunk and go back to the tree trunk and survive this way. Just going to stop it. Whoop. And I just have a few more slides. So just want to finish that. So now what I do in Hong Kong is to train the next generation of myrmecologists from Hong Kong, but also from all over the world. A very open lab. We are a very international team. I love that. And there's that little one here, which is my daughter. She was 13 months now she's 23 months. But there's something amazing with her. She can already say ants in 3 different languages. Okay, ants for me in French and Hali in Japanese. Her mom is Japanese, so she's very good. And she showed me the ants, so I'm looking forward to go and collect more ants with her in the future. So what I want to conclude with after 17 years is that our knowledge on biodiversity is extremely limited. Okay, and this is a real limitation where we try to understand the impact that as humans we are having on biodiversity. And those threats are really increasing, and increasing very, very fast. If you get a chance to travel, you realize that it's a bit depressing, honestly. And there's too few and misdirected conservation action that are conducted. We need to value more the small organisms, because those are the ones that actually compose most of diversity, and they are very important for our all well-being. I know people always think about insects like mosquitoes and annoying things, but those are a tiny minority. The majority of insects are actually very important. They do fantastic things, and there's many things like the gliding ants that we can still discover, so we should all be curious and observant about all those things. And I want to thank you with that. And if you want to contribute or join the lab or that exploration, you're very welcome to talk to me. You can support biodiversity discoveries. If you are wealthy, you can give us funding so we can actually describe new species with your name or whatever name you would like. We have a program called Name an Ant, and if you want to look at it, or if you're curious, I can talk more about it. So now I think I maybe have a bit of time for question. 1, 2, a bit long, sorry. Thank you.